I mean, starting out, Happy New Year to you. Are you a big New Year's resolution guy, Bob?
No, I'm not a big New Year's resolution guy. I pretty much just put my head down and go to work. And I do, if I do a New Year's resolution, I guess it's just kind of a coincidence that it goes with New Year. If I want to get something done, I'm going to put my mind to it and get it done. Probably doesn't matter what time of year.
I think it's best not to have any. I'd said I'd drink more water, and I did not do that today. So not off to a
Well,
good
you
start.
still got 300 something 60 days left to fulfill it. So you could still, I think you can still get it done.
I can turn it around. Well, we appreciate you being on. We wanted to have you on and hear more about you. The whole goal of this podcast really is for fun, but to really learn about people that we don't typically hear from every Sunday. And while we hear from you almost every day on Twitter and FS1, we don't really know a whole lot about you. So we just wanted to bring you on and talk to you.
All right. Hopefully it's a good one. May not be interesting as that old Davey Allison poster you got there, but
yeah.
do my best.
Awesome. Well, we got to talk to you a little bit on the Pocono podcast that we did, but we wanted to hear a little bit more about how you became a sports writer at the Daytona Beach News Journal.
Yeah, so I went to Indiana University and studied journalism there and worked for the school paper there in the late 80s and early 90s. And when I graduated, I sent out about 250 resumes or so, and Daytona Beach called first, and I got that job. And so I packed up I think I brought my brother's hand-me-down Camaro or something like that. Had some rust strategically placed on the hood and put everything I owned in there and drove to work for the Daytona paper, kind of based in DeLand, about 20 miles outside of Daytona. So that's how I got to Daytona Beach. Just the first job out of college, covering a couple of high schools, and there's this track then called Volusia County Speedway that was about 15 to 20 minutes from DeLand. And they had a Busch Series race back in the day. They were asphalt, and it's now Volusia Speedway Park. Maybe more of your listeners know that, and it had gone from a dirt track to an asphalt track. When I was there, it had just become an asphalt track, and soon after they realized it was difficult to keep the asphalt. The asphalt was actually breaking up. They were running a July 4 weekend Busch race there, and it was so hot that the pavement was actually coming apart, and so they ended up making that a dirt track again.
Yeah. So would you say, when would you say, you told us you were covering a little bit of some of the smaller tracks, but when did your fandom become full blown for NASCAR?
Well, I've always approached NASCAR as a journalist. But obviously if you're working in Daytona, first off, I grew up in Indianapolis, so I knew racing, but I wasn't all that familiar with stock car racing. And so when you move to Daytona, there's this thing called the Daytona 500, and it takes a lot of people to, and as the sport grew, it took more and more people to write about it. But, I started covering the Daytona 500 in 92 and other Speed Week events in the years after that. And so, and back then, teams were allowed to test in December. It would be like Ford would have 3 days, and then Chevy would have 3 days, and then Dodge would have 3 days, and then Xfinity would have 3 days, and trucks would have 3 days. And then January, that would happen again. Mm-hmm. So a lot of times we would see drivers in December. We would see them in January. We would see them again, obviously, in February, and we see them in July. So there was a lot of time to talk to drivers and kind of immerse yourself in NASCAR. Then I didn't become really full-time cover NASCAR until 2003. In September 2003, I joined the staff at NASCAR Scene magazine.
What do you have any advice for anybody looking to go your route into sports journalism of really how to grow their career to the point you've gotten?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of different paths. I would say, if you look at, my my history, I worked at the Daytona paper for 12 years before I started covering NASCAR full time for a weekly magazine that turned into a website and then folded into other websites. But, and if you look at like Jeff Gluck, he worked for the Rocky Mount, North Carolina newspaper, and then out in San Bernardino, California, newspaper. And Nate Ryan worked for the Richmond paper and the San Bernardino paper. And, so a lot of us didn't just get into it to cover racing. We got into it to cover sports, right? And racing in some ways found us, or we, it was an opportunity that came up, through our careers. And, and I think you enjoyed watching it like we do other sports, and it provided a career path. And I think that's, if you're looking to get into racing, whether it's public relations or marketing, I would say don't just focus on racing, focus on lots of things. And if you have a job that could potentially have a little bit of racing, it allows you to learn about other things, help you do things that you're uncomfortable with, but also have a lot of contacts both inside and outside of racing that can help you throughout your career. So that's my main advice to people. That's you're as long as you have some racing that you can do, people are going to notice, whether it's at a short track, or a big track. There's enough people who are going to be around and who are going to follow what you do that you can be noticed. Again, I would say about 90% of the media center have college degrees. So a college degree is still important. And and again, if you look at where people are hiring, they're hiring like the Charlotte Observer's NASCAR writer. She was doing an internship at the Washington Post, right? And so they saw a sports writer who they want on their staff, and she's doing soccer and NASCAR. She doesn't have a whole lot of NASCAR background, but they know that she's a good reporter and a good writer, and she can learn about NASCAR. And I think that's the way, and that's going to help. That helped her not only get this job that she has, but it can help in her getting jobs going forward. If NASCAR, if there comes a point where they say, okay, we're going to have less NASCAR coverage, right? So I think that's the key.
For sure. So do you currently live in New York City? Is that right?
I do. Yep.
So how did you get to New York City?
That's where my wife is. And so I wanted to spend more time with my wife. And when going back and forth from Charlotte to New York was, it wasn't always it's not the most fun. Long distance relationships are never fun. And, my job primarily is to be at the track on the weekends. And there's certainly as many planes flying out of New York, if not more, than Charlotte. And you can also easily get to Charlotte. So I think that's one of the other things that, when you talk about advice, is that you can now do your, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, you couldn't necessarily do your job from anywhere. And certainly there's, obviously if something comes up, I'm not a 15-minute or a 30-minute drive from the shops in Charlotte, but, you can, I used to go to Charlotte very somewhat often, and visit shops or go and talk to people or do things. So I think the thing is that now you don't necessarily need to, there's certainly more flexibility in where you base yourself and what you and in covering the sport.
For sure. Yeah, we're all working virtual these days.
Yeah.
So what is a typical day-to-day in normal world? So like prior to this past year, what was it a day-to-day for you normally? And then how has that changed this past year?
Well, at the racetrack, it was always just getting there when the garage opened and walk around a racetrack talking to people. My job is pretty much a networking job, right? You go talk to one person and then you find something out, you go talk to the next person to see if that person was lying to you. And, and you look around and you see, and you had a schedule of when some interviews were taking place. so it's really a mix of, okay, these interviews or press conferences are scheduled at these times, and these other times you're walking around networking with people. Often I'd have a list of people I'd want to see or topics I wanted to cover to make sure that, I was always trying to check on news. And then, post race obviously was talking to drivers and crew chiefs after the race and doing writing. During the week, typical day now is to go try to get in a 5K first thing in the morning, and listen to a racing podcast while I'm doing it. So it's work in a little bit of ways, right? It takes you want to look good for TV, right? So so it's a little bit of workout, a little bit of personal health, and a little bit of work all mixed into one. And then it's mainly phone calls and texts and writing and planning and Zoom meetings and Zoom calls and that kind of thing. Obviously, Zoom is new for most of us since the pandemic started. And when you ask how things change, it's a matter of, at the racetrack, you can, when I would talk to people, typically it was when they're just kind of hanging out, right? A crew chief who's hanging by the garage, he's kind of done with what he needs to do. You go up and you can have a casual conversation. And now, you're pretty much, texting people or emailing people, and you really don't know how busy they are, right? You don't know, you don't want to bother them if they're really busy, but you don't really know. So I think the biggest challenge now is that you don't, that flow of information doesn't come as casually or as easily. Mm-hmm. And I think the other thing that we miss is that we don't get a lot of feedback. We don't get, if you're walking around the garage and you've just written something, there'll be people come up to you and either say nice story or that was BS, and it's good to hear both, right? It's good to hear, if you have good relationships, people feel comfortable saying, hey, you missed the boat on that one. And that's important for us to hear, right? We may not agree with it, but it's important to hear what people are thinking. And I think we miss a lot of that feedback, and we miss a lot of that, hey, you wrote this, but you know what you really should check out. We don't get a lot of that right now through Zoom calls. So it also means you're on the phone, I would say, a little bit more during the week with people that you normally would have seen at the track, which then means less time on phone during the week of people who you wouldn't see at the track, right? Because usually, there's no reason for me to call a crew chief during the week if I'm already going to see him Friday, Saturday, or Sunday. But if I haven't talked to a crew chief in a month and I want to touch base on some stuff, then that's going to require a phone call now during the week.
So how many times has it happened where you've had one of these guys come up? Because when I went to journalism school at a little school called Murray State, and
that's
I wrote
in Kentucky, right?
Yep.
All right.
Little town in Western Kentucky, and I wrote an article one time that got one of the deans of the business school upset, who I was friends with. So I want to know how often it happens to Bob Pockrass, where he writes something and Chase Elliott or Jimmy Johnson's coming up to you going, hey,
occasionally. They don't usually. I think, it's all about relationships, right? Mm-hmm. And you hope that they're comfortable enough that they're willing to tell you or talk to you. There have been times where people said, where publicist says, hey, come to the hall, or someone. So they just want to help understand why you did something, or why you wrote it this way. And those conversations are good for both of us.
Right.
How often does it happen? I would say, as far as the subjects of the story, maybe 5 to 10 times a year, but I would say, probably 20 times during the year, like somebody in the garage is probably mad at you on something. And it's the challenge of covering NASCAR versus other sports. Like if you were covering like a baseball team, you're with the home team all the time, right? So if you write something about the visiting team, they may not see you for another 3 months. But in NASCAR, if there's a fight or if there's a controversy, there's always going to be two sides to the story, right? And usually neither side is going to be you're probably thinking the same way, or if you present an opinion, there's going to be one side that doesn't agree with you, and so it's okay. I think that I start doing journalism in the early, I went to college, I graduated high school in 87, no cell phones or anything. And somebody could, cuss you out or be mean to you, and nobody would know except for you and that person. Right. And now everything is on video. Everything is, there aren't a lot of private conversations, or as many private conversations. So I think there's probably less of that now than there was before, just because, it's not worth making a scene and having a little bit of drama. Not that I mean, again, you want to have good relationships with people, but again, the nature of the business is that there are going to be people who are upset with you from time to time.
And over the years, I mean, there's no question of why you're dedicated to this. And you've just listed probably 10 or 15 reasons what keeps the excitement going. On top of all that, and you mentioned earlier that you do cover it from a journalistic perspective, and we obviously understand that part, but have you had any favorite drivers or been a fan of anybody?
Well, I mean, I think, I mean, Jeff Gordon was always a driver who, no matter what you asked, it seemed like even though he was answering it for the 100th time, it sounded like he was answering it for the first time. And it felt like that he thought about the answer, or his reaction was natural enough that, you're like, okay, he's treating the question with respect. Right. And that's and that's all you ask. So I always respected that out of Jeff, because, and the thing about Jeff is that there'd be times where he would go inside his hauler for 40 minutes after a race, talk to his crew chief, and then he would come out and he would talk to us. We would still be waiting there, especially those of us, like if I worked for NASCAR Scene magazine and we had another reporter in the media center to talk to the winner, and he would spend the time with us then, and it wasn't like he was trying to rush or I mean, he still maybe was wanting to rush and get out, but he always respected the time. Dale Jr. is, especially, I was saying the last 8-10 years of his career was always very respectful, and, and didn't, and just, again, was a guy who seemed to, really want to answer the questions so that you understood what he was saying. So, I'd say that those guys, those have kind of been the ones who I felt have given us a lot of respect in the media and have appreciated it. I always say my favorite drivers are the ones who, or I wouldn't say my favorite drivers, but people ask me, what do I want to see in a race? And I always say, I want to see 40 drivers get out of their car, and be healthy. That's, if that happens, then, then everything else is good.
Mm-hmm.
For sure. So it's jokes about that you're everywhere, and you are. It's on your Twitter page, on your banner. It's your face in the middle of a fight, like you're just in the middle of it. And so, and we've learned a little bit about how you make connections, and you know everybody within the garage, and that's how you get a lot of your information. How often is it that you're getting your information formally versus informally, where somebody who's really not supposed to be telling you within an organization is telling you something?
Yeah. I mean, I would say 75% is formally, and maybe 25% is informally. And most of the informal stuff needs to be confirmed through a formal channel before. I tell people, unless it's a very rare occasion where I want somebody to risk their job to give me information. Like that would only occur if there's a safety issue of some sort, or it's hard for me to even think of, of what that would be, again, it would probably it would have to be a safety issue or some sort of legal issue that, I mean, I don't want somebody to lose a job over what they tell me. I don't think that, that's worth it for them, Now, right. They still may want to do it. They still may want to say it, and that's fine, okay. But, I'm not out there, I don't want anybody to feel like, that they could get fired for telling me this. But right. Then again, if somebody feels like that they're telling me something that they feel like they might get fired for, then it might be a place that they don't want to be anyway. Right. Right. So, but again, I would say it's mostly I would say again, it's about 75% people who are comfortable telling me, and there certainly are times where they say, hey, this is on background, you're gonna have to find it from, another source. And sometimes it's funny because you'll hear that from somebody, and then 10 minutes later, somebody will say, hey, did you hear about this? And it's like, oh yeah, a lot more people know about it than what this person just told me. But, I think the key, when you talk about that, is that the question is, what is somebody's agenda, right? If a team owner says, hey, I'm about to hire somebody, are they telling you that or a team executive saying that, are they telling you that so that other people who are trying to get that driver stop pursuing that driver, right? Or if somebody tells you, hey, we got this sponsor, but the sponsor isn't confirming it yet, you wonder, are they really have it, or are they trying to keep others from doing it? Or if they're asking you, hey, don't, that's not true yet, are they telling you it's not true because it's not, or because they're trying to protect sensitive negotiations, or just negotiations they don't want out there? So right. I think it's and so you're always balancing that. You're always wondering, okay, why is this person telling me this? Because I think I'm a nice person, but I don't know that they're telling me if because they want to be helpful. They're not always telling me to be helpful to me. There sometimes is an ulterior or a motive that will help themselves, or they just feel that it's news that should get out there.
Well, and we read this article by Jeff Gluck, and he mentioned that you will, in your spare time, sometimes peruse court files and all this extensive information. Is that truth? That's
true. Did you see Chris Buescher? Do you see Roush Fenway's tweet the other day with Chris Buescher? They were talking about speeding tickets, and they asked him about speeding. He got like 2 tickets in a week, I think. And they were like, do you know how we know about this? This was just like Roush. And he's like, yeah, I think Bob Pockrass was creeping on some public records. And, look, speeding tickets, as long as it's not 100 miles an hour, you're probably not going to write a full story or do much with it. But I'm always checking public records as much as I can from New York. And I think it's part of being a journalist. It's part of knowing what's going on. Everybody wants to know, well, how much does a driver get paid, or how much is a sponsorship worth? And the only way to know that is through public records, because unless nobody's going to give you a copy of the contract, so the only way to know to do that is to find these things where they've gotten into legal issues, and where they become public records and public documents. So that's just part of being a journalist.
And you mentioned earlier that you'll run and listen to a podcast or something like that. We know you're listening to ours when you're running. So what are some of the other outlets that you're using? I mean, what type of podcasts are you listening to, or what type of news are you listening to better educate yourself?
Right. So, first off, to plug Fox, I listen to Michael Waltrip's podcast, and I listen to the People's Sports Podcast, this podcast that Fox Sports recently started. That's a general sports podcast. I'll listen to the Dirty Mo Media podcast, Dale Jr.'s and Door Bumper Clear. I listen to Jeff Gluck and Jordan Bianchi's podcast, The Teardown from The Athletic. I listen to Nate Ryan's NBC podcast. I listen to Kelly Crandall's interviews that she does on the Racing Writers podcast. I'll listen to ESPN's daily podcast. I listen to a couple of sports media podcasts, and when I get time, especially during the off season when all these aren't around, I'll listen to what's a podcast called The Next Big Idea, which is often a podcast done by authors, and talks, often somebody who's maybe thinks a little bit differently or has studied some sort of issue. And discusses that. And I listen to all my podcasts on double time. So you're wondering, gosh, he listens to a lot of podcasts. But I listen to them all at double speed. So it's very strange to hear Dale Jr. talk now, because I'm used to listening to his podcast when he's talking 2 times as fast. So, but I think that's a great way to listen to podcasts, especially if you're just trying to, generate ideas for yourself or see what people are saying. You're not hanging necessarily on every word that they say, and you can obviously get a lot more done.
Mm-hmm.
And Dale Jr. might sound normal. He's got that slow twang, so he might just actually sound like a normal person talking. So
it was only hard when he had Steve Letarte on, because when Letarte talked, it was really, really fast.
He talks fast, yeah. So a recent poll found that NASCAR had a strong growth within the Gen Z adults, which is 18 to 23. And over the past decade, so many people just talk about the decline of NASCAR in different areas. What do you think contributed to that growth, and how is that sustainable with young kids and even into millennials?
Yeah, it was great to see that. Do I have an explanation for it? No. Is it? I mean, I think the key is relevancy, and is the car making a little bit of a comeback now? Are people now getting back into cars after there was a time they were, a car is just a mode of transportation, right? And it's if I can get a zip car and not own a car, then cool, I won't own a car. And so maybe there's a little bit, maybe especially at this time, people are at home, maybe just kind of working on cars or learning more about cars. Maybe it's increased enthusiasm for the cars. I think as the younger drivers get a little bit more popular, showing a little bit more personality, I mean, Chase Elliott's the most popular driver, but him giving the middle finger salute to Kyle Busch out there, and then winning the bounty and doing Kyle Busch's bow, right? Doing the bow, that was something that I don't know that Chase Elliott from 3 or 4 years ago would do, right? But now he seems, comfortable a little bit more who he is. I mean, great, it's just 24, right? So I think some of these young drivers are now showing a little bit more personality, and maybe that is in engaging more fans as well. So, I think the key is that it's the key is going to be to create passion, and what creates passion. And the other sports, team sports, have that, because if you grew up whatever city you grew up in, you're probably a fan of those sports teams, and whatever college or city your parents are from, you're probably a fan of those teams, right? Mm-hmm. And in NASCAR, it used to be, well, if your family was a Chevy family or a Ford family, and so you root for Chevy drivers or Ford drivers, and there's not that much, right? Yeah, you look at your sign behind you, but there are fewer and fewer people who are like that, right? The connection to a manufacturer has decreased, and so NASCAR has to find ways to create passion. And the other way, and I'm rambling a little bit, but the other way other sports create passion is that not only do you root for the teams that you're from, but you root for people who are from your area, right? So when I worked for Daytona Beach for 12 years, I covered Vince Carter in high school. All right. Nice. I covered Ryan Lochte in high school. So athletes like those who then go on for, into bigger fame, those communities are going to root for those teams or those individuals. And what happened in NASCAR is that a lot of the drivers never raced at a hometown track, right? Or Eric Jones raced 1 year in Michigan before doing national or regional races, and he didn't build up that fan base. And so I think now you look at somebody like Chase Elliott, who remains living in Georgia, and that parade that he had in Dawsonville. Yeah. If every driver had that type of hometown passion, now granted that you're talking about generations of Elliots there, so that certainly helps. But if other drivers have that passion that from their communities, I think that would be obviously a huge boost, because people have a reason to watch on Sundays. I often use Joe Nemechek as an example, and that, Joe Nemechek isn't the most personable guy in the world, right? But he raced for years in Florida. And if you were from Florida, you watched on Sundays because you had watched Joe Nemechek on Saturday nights at your local track. And I think NASCAR needs to find ways to get back to that kind of connection with their fans. And I think they're doing a little bit better job of it. And maybe that is a little bit also a reason why they seem to be on a little bit of an uptick.
That's a great point and perspective. It seems in NASCAR, everybody's got an opinion. I know you see this on social media all day, how they can make the sport different or better in their eyes. So changing the playoff, changing the point system, adding this track, taking away that track, more road courses, all this stuff. Is there anything that you feel passionate about that NASCAR could do differently in the future? Whether it would be really hard for them to achieve or not, is there anything that you feel passionate about that they should be doing?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we talked about it a little bit. I think that they should say a team can only have 2 charters, but they can have 3 or 4 if they put a diversity driver or a local track champion in a truck. Because I think that's the way to create passion, right? You creating a reason, you're giving a talented individual an opportunity that they might not be able to have if they don't have sponsorship, right? Why, everybody wants Josh Berry at Junior Motorsports to do well, right? Everybody's rooting for him because they've been watching him in North Carolina for years, win lots of races. So there needs to be a way for the Josh Berrys of the world, their other driver, the Bubba Pollards of the world, trying to think of, Clay Rogers from the Tennessee area. You need those, or I'm sorry if he's not from Tennessee, he might be from Carolina, but the drivers who race locally to have a path up to Cup and not be having to spend $600, $750 grand, $1 million to run a 12 race ARCA schedule. That's why I think that I would like to see NASCAR have an incentive program that the Cup owners, and look, I know they're spending a lot of money, but there needs to be an incentive program for them to work with young drivers. And in that sense, I'm a big believer. I'm not a big believer in saying Cup drivers should only do 5 Xfinity races. What I do think they should do is say Cup drivers can do 5 Xfinity races, but they can do 10 or 12 if that car runs the rest of the year with 1 or 2 young non-Cup drivers. Because what I think NASCAR needs to do is find a sponsor, because I believe that would encourage a team, much like Ganassi did, with and without this type of incentive, where you'd have, if I'm a sponsor and I want Kyle Busch and I can get him for 10 or 12 races, maybe I spend the extra $1 million, pay this young kid virtually nothing, right? Or he gets purse money, but I'm gonna spend that extra money on Kyle Busch and potentially spend a little extra money, be aligned with a young driver, give that young driver an opportunity, but also potentially that sponsor might also want to work with that young driver as well. And so then when Kyle Busch retires, maybe that young driver now, if they performed well, has a connection to this sponsor. So I just think that NASCAR, that sometimes they make decisions that I want them to create passion. That's what I want to do. And I think just and I just think the Kyle Busch rule of, you can only have this Cup drivers can only do 5 races. I mean, most of them weren't doing more than 5. It was only Kyle Busch and people, I always felt they didn't hate as much that Kyle Busch won as much as that he blew by the field, right? He was just so much better and they didn't want to see a butt whipping. If you had Chase Briscoe and Kyle Busch fighting for the win like they did at Darlington every week, I don't think anybody would mind Kyle Busch in the Xfinity races, right? But that's not what has happened. And so I do think that, again, it does NASCAR no good to have Penske run a part-time car for just their Cup drivers and not have another driver running the rest of the series. Like, to me, that does nothing. Right. Except get that Cup driver a little extra experience or help maybe with a 1 race or 2 race sponsor. But if we can find a way to have that and also potentially and have an incentive program to have a younger driver in there, I think that again would help. And again, that would, you would hope, and maybe this, you asked if it's possible or not, and I'm dreaming, but like, okay, so let's say they need an extra $1 million or $2 million to run the rest of the year without that cup driver. Is that going to be from a sponsor, or is that going to be a driver who brings money? Well, okay, maybe it's a driver who brings money, but maybe potentially it opens up another opportunity for the Josh Berrys of the world to potentially get a significant number of races and show what they can do.
For sure. So matters of the heart, Bob. I mean, people hate one lug nut. They hate that they're bringing the synchronous gearbox. Everybody's, it's going to be an F1 car before we know it. Do you have as strong of feelings about some of this stuff as the thousands of people who will comment on one of your posts?
Right. Like, here's the thing. I want 5 lug nuts, and I think NASCAR actually wanted 5 lug nuts, but I mean, and listen, I talked to the Wood brothers about this, and they're good with one lug nut because they just don't see, because first off, if it's a steel 5 lug nuts, it's too heavy at 18 inches wide. All right. Okay. It just, you can't physically, it's going to be difficult. So if you're going to aluminum 18-inch wheel, they could not figure out a way, they say, to do it 5 lug nuts and have the integrity of the wheel. That you had to have a center, that had to be one big center lug to really have the integrity that they needed out of that wheel, and that they tried and they couldn't come up with it. You know, and the Wood brothers believe it, so I'm gonna be like, okay, I believe it. You know, like, part of me is like, well, they have the greatest engineers in the garage. Couldn't somebody have figured it out? But you know. So, and look, you know, some your own car, some have 5 lug nuts, a lot have a center lug. So, I mean, I think I wanted to see pit stops with 5 lug nuts. That's what I would want, but I understand why they're making the change with all the other changes to the next gen car, that, you know, that this was one that it's unfortunate. I don't think it's going to ruin the sport. I mean, I don't, you know, when you watch the films of people doing a center lug nut and still having to carry the tires and put it on, I mean, it's not, I mean, yeah, it's a little bit different, but it's still going to take, it's still the movement and the synchronicity of the pit stop is still there. So, you know, I don't hate it, but I don't, you know, I think it's unfortunate that it's there. So I haven't heard as many complaints about the sequential gearbox. You know, I mean, the whole car is supposed to be designed so that it'll race better on road courses, partly. So that's why they're adding going to 6 or 7 road courses. Right. And you want a car that runs well on road course. You want to be able to see drivers slinging that thing around and not necessarily fighting the car as much as they do now, right? And kind of seeing cars. I mean, you want to see them go fast, and so you want to see them be able to maneuver. And so, you know, I think that a lot of some of these changes are designed to do that. The body changes are designed to do 2 things. One is to prevent a cut tire, right? You know, with the composite, but you don't see cut tires in Xfinity from cars banging into each other door to door, right? Because it just pops back out as you would with the steel. And then the other is that they hope that, you know, that it brings back the ability to get up on somebody's rear corner and get them loose and go by them, right? And that's, like, to me, that's a big deal. You know, we always joke about, remember when Kyle Busch ran into the back of Smithley, right? He ran in the back of Smithley a year and a half ago. And to me, the most amazing thing on that was that he didn't wreck, and nobody wrecked, you know? I mean, that's how planted those cars are to the ground. And so, you know, that to me, that was the worst part of it. Like, how can you hit somebody that hard and then both still keep going? So if you're able to use the draft, or not use the draft, but if you're able to get beside somebody, especially on a short track or a big track, and able to get up on their corner and just loosen them a little bit to get by them, I think that's going to create the racing that people want to see, without it being necessarily as like draft dependent as it is right now on some of the intermediate tracks.
Yeah. So switching gears just a little bit. You did a video about Jimmy Johnson, and I've been a big Jimmy Johnson fan. And you said it kind of captured the essence of Jimmy Johnson. And I watched it probably like 6 or 7 times. So, I mean, it was just so cool to see that. And when there's somebody that transcendent and has been in the sport so long, what's it like when somebody like that leaves? And how long do you think it's going to be before we see somebody of that magnitude come back into the sport?
Well, I mean, again, from what we talked about earlier, I know there are a lot of people, there are a lot of Jimmy Johnson haters out there, but if you go to the West Coast, when you went to the West Coast, there were a ton of Jimmy Johnson fans. And so, so now who are all these fans going to root for? Are they going to, are they going to root for Kyle Larson because he's from California? I don't know. Are they rooting for Harvick because he has California roots? I just think that a lot of people gravitated towards Jimmy. He had come up through bikes and off-road, a lot of people that enthused a lot of people in California. He was very relatable to a West Coast crowd. So, I mean, I think I don't think you don't really, you certainly don't replace him, with one person. I think his fans will have to choose other drivers to follow, and hopefully they have a choice, hopefully that there's other people. Now, will they start following Alex Bowman because he's in the 48 now? I don't know about that. When you had Bill Elliott leave, Casey Kane, a lot of Bill Elliott fans became Casey Kane fans, right? Because he got into that car. I don't know that you're going to have, I think Alex Bowman has his fan base and they'll go with him, but I don't know that you're going to see a lot of, I was a Jimmy Johnson 48 fan. I've got to root for Alex Bowman now, again, I just think, certainly there's a void, but, the thing is that Jimmy's he won one title in the last 7 years, right? So there have been a lot of other people who've won titles. It's not like it's somebody who's won a bunch of titles recently, or for that matter, won races recently, that replacing. So I think fans have certainly had their time to be able to kind of find the driver that they want to root for in their post Jimmy Johnson fandom.
For sure.
With a lot of big drivers and even small ones, you've followed them their whole career. Like Jimmy, there's a lot of good, there's a lot of bad. You see crown jewels, notch, championships, and even like scandals, bad stuff like scandals with Jeremy Mayfield, Kyle Larson, and then unfortunately even death sometimes. So what comes to mind when it's like the best and the worst of the stories that you've got to cover?
Well, I mean, I think everybody would say the worst would have been Dale Sr.'s death, right? In the 2001 Daytona 500, just because of the emotions and the realization that, there were 3 drivers who died the year before of similar injury, and not much was done about it, and there wasn't a whole lot of, people were more, death happened. So it didn't necessarily it certainly was concerning to people, but it wasn't, the reaction certainly didn't, they didn't start changing rules after Adam Petty died, right? It's the unfortunate thing that it took Dale Sr., the tragedy of Dale Sr. to really force the sport to really examine itself and make change. And so, so that to me, certainly was one of the saddest days. And then I would say, when you were there in July that year and Dale Jr. wins the race in Daytona is, one of the more incredible moments of what happens on that day. If you talk about incredible championship moments, I would have to say the Tony Stewart Carl Edwards battle was one of those moments that you're like, oh my gosh, what's happening? How's Tony coming back? And are they really going to end in a tie? And is it going to the tiebreaker? And is this really the same Tony Stewart who I was standing next to, 10 weeks earlier when Dustin Long asked him if he was one of the favorites, and he said no, he wouldn't pick him or anything like that. So it's there's certainly been a lot of ups and downs, and and there are things that I think especially when you're covering sport in the 90s, there's a driver from Daytona who died in Daytona the same week Neil Bonnet did. His name was Rodney Orr, who died in Daytona practice. And I covered him from his Goodies Dash Series days, and then when Tony Renna died in Indianapolis in a test, and he was from DeLand, Florida, and he was racing in he was in the Indy 500 Firestone tests at Indianapolis for the Indy 500 or IndyCar, and died. I think those, obviously when you know people that well, and their families, it's certainly heartbreaking, and it's then it was part of racing, and it's still part of racing. But I think one of the things that Ryan Newman's wreck taught or reminded everyone is that this is just such a dangerous sport, and and tragedies can and do happen.
So, we know you like to hike, or you like to run, but I always see pictures of you. It looks like you're hiking. Do you also like to hike too?
No, usually I'm running, or a lot of those pictures I take when I'm running. So, I do some hiking, but not a ton. There aren't that many places to hike around here.
So the pictures are just pretty. So I assume you're hiking. But you're actually running. Is it? So what are the other things that you like to do? Any other sports that you're watching, or any other hobbies that you have?
Yeah, I watch a lot of sports. And especially working for Daytona Pay for 12 years, I covered the World Cup when it was in Orlando. Nice. And then in the 90s, so always paying attention to what's going on in the soccer world. I think, I watch a lot of college sports, and pro football and pro basketball, a little baseball. I think there's, I love the speed of a pro football game. It's just amazing. If you're, when you cover it, and if you're down on the field for the last 3 or 4 minutes before the end of the game, it's just an amazing thing to see just how quick and how violent that game is. Basketball to me is just a beautiful game, thought I couldn't get enough watching of Allen Iverson, and just right. what he could do with a basketball. So I watch a lot of, I try to pay attention to what's going on in other sports. Obviously during the season, I don't really pay a lot of attention to football till November a lot of times. It's, but I'm mostly paying attention to that, or I'm listening to podcasts as I'm running.
In your spare time. In your spare time.
Yeah.
So
well, yeah, go ahead, Bart.
You've been in the sport for like nearly 30 years now, if you count all your days back in Daytona. And for us, we're just fans, but we're just getting started with this podcast. I've been doing it for almost a year now. What kind of advice do you have for us, maybe, if you had wished you had known something when you were getting involved in NASCAR or even into auto racing back in the day?
Yeah, I would just say, be open to new ideas, and be open to, I think what NASCAR learned this year is that they can do anything, right? No practice, no qualifying, only 4 or 5 crew members per car, and you just like we were talking about the single lug, okay, you may hate it right now, but at least watch it and give it a chance, and then make a decision. You still may hate it, but I was somebody who, I didn't think Eldora for trucks was going to be all that great a race, mainly because it couldn't be as great as like the Dream, where you had actual cars that were designed to race on a dirt track race. If I want to go to a dirt track, I want to see Bloomquist and Josh Richards and these guys who make their names on racing dirt late models. But that race turned out to be a pretty good race, right? It may have been, they weren't going as fast as maybe you wish they were, but that race just turned into a great event. So I would just say be open-minded, and that doesn't mean you shouldn't give your opinion. Give your opinion, but then when it actually happens, be like open-minded enough to at least say, okay, I'm gonna watch it and see if I actually can stomach it or not not hate it as much, you know? So,
Yeah.
you know, that would be my advice.
Yeah,
So,
we tried to do that throughout the year. As we noticed that we were kind of getting complainy for a little bit, and then we said Steve Phelps is actually doing a good job here, and we asked for something different, and he delivered it. So let's see how it goes.
Well, and I mean, and the thing is, it's I mean, like, it's good to have opinions, right? Because you want people to listen to your podcast for opinions, right? You don't want it to just be, oh, everything is great or okay, you know. But I would say just, you know, it's okay to say that you were wrong. You were wrong, and it's okay to say, you know, hey, I didn't agree with it. And the fact is that once you start doing it, people remember what you said, so you're not going to be able to run away from it. So it's fine to say, hey, I was not a fan of this, but I watched it and it's starting to grow on me a little bit.
I don't think the double yellow line's ever going to grow on me. I think
For sure.
Yeah, well, and that's okay. You know, that's you know, that's I would say this: don't let your frustrations ruin your enthusiasm for the sport.
For sure.
For sure.
Well, Bob, we're getting close to our time here, over it. So we appreciate you a lot. The last thing we wanted to ask you is, we obviously want to be able to highlight guys like you who we might hear from but don't know as well. You know, we've talked to people like Howard Hitchcock from Lionel Racing, and talked to younger guys like Kaz Gralla. Who are the type of people that you think that we should be reaching out to kind of give a different story than what we get to see every Friday, Saturday, and Sunday on national television?
Oh, that's a great question. You know, there are just so many people in the garage, but you know, like I would say, like, you know, depending on what your goals are for the podcast, you know, I would like research, and, you know, there's a lot of people like Mike Beam, who has great stories, you know, who runs GMS Racing. So he can talk about the state of affairs. Somebody like him can talk about the state of affairs of the truck series now, but also with the perspective of having worked in the Cup garage for 20 or 30 years. There are a lot of people like that, you know, working for, especially like on the truck and the Xfinity side, who have been around for decades, you know, and like, and even a guy like a Carl Long or a Timmy Hill, you know, those guys who have been, you know, Timmy Hill's been racing for 10 years. I couldn't believe it, virtually, I think, already. I want to say he was a rookie of the year in one of the series in like 2010 or 2011, I want to say. So maybe not that long, maybe it's 7 or 8, but it's like, just don't dismiss somebody because maybe they're not well known, or they run for a team that doesn't make a lot of noise. You know, a guy like a JJ Yaley, you know, he's been around for a long time, has raced all sorts of cars, will be racing in the Chili Bowl. Justin Allgaier, you know, has been racing for decades, and his family has deep roots in the sport, and they can really explain what's going on in the sport from maybe a different perspective, maybe from the perspective of having been with big teams and having been with small teams, and knowing, you know, what the challenges are for both, and maybe having a little bit of a good perspective on, you know, on what it takes and what impact rules might have, not just on their team, but on everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Well, again, we appreciate it. You know, we had a dream of having you on the show a long time ago, and thanks to Pocono for introducing us, and thank you for taking the time to be on with us.
I appreciate it, and hope you know, and I would say, though, that if you do get a Ford driver, that maybe you're gonna have to take out their sign, or get a parking for Ford racing fans only sign.
I'll put one beside it.
Or something like that, so that they feel a little more comfortable. So
for sure.
Davey drove a Ford, so it's a mix of both if they're looking back and forth.
That's true. That's true.
For sure. Awesome. Well, thanks, Bob, and have a good one. And we'll look forward to hearing from you every day for the next 365 of them.
All right. Looking forward to it. Thank you, guys.
Bye.